I want you to understand as we begin a new series today that Hugh Meyer in his communion meditation set it up beautifully. I trust that you can remember what Hugh said to us as he was up here giving his meditation, because he did such a beautiful job of setting up what we're going to deal with today. When God calls, lessons from Esther. We're going to spend the next several weeks in Esther. How many of you read the book Esther? Yeah. How many of you have seen the movie Esther? Yeah, I'll tell you, it's one of my favorite in the entire Bible. I love the story in the book of Esther. But we're going to find some real interesting things with Esther as we go through it. So we're going to spend probably June and July in the book of Esther. So read it as we go through it. And maybe we'll find some things that you never expected to see. Today, the title of the message is Out of the Ashes. Let me ask you a very deep theological question today. How many of you like jigsaw puzzles? You can't be my friends anymore. I tell you what, I love Sudoku. I love Sudoku. I love crossword puzzles. I love word searches, but when it comes to jigsaw puzzles, my adult ADD kicks in. And I can't stand it. I can't stand finding all those pieces scattered everywhere to put back into one place. I mean, it drives me nuts. I don't like doing that. But I want to tell you, as we start reading in the book of Esther, I think we find a jigsaw puzzle. I think we find a very big jigsaw puzzle that God is putting back together. You see, jigsaw puzzles require knowing where each of the pieces return. My wife has met an artist recently that paints pictures and does some wonderful work. And then she has those pictures cut into jigsaw puzzles. And so they have the art on the wall, and the jigsaw puzzle goes with it. So they look at the art on the wall and put the jigsaw puzzle together. Might be able to do that if there were maybe 9 or 10 pieces. But it's amazing how people can just take those things which don't seem to go together and bring them back. And I really do believe that's where the Israelites were during this time when we're going to find the book of Esther written. The Israelites, let me just tell you, they were in pieces. Let's just say that. After their favorite king, who happened to be King who? Oh, who's Israel's favorite king? Better be David, right? After David, his favorite king, his son Solomon, his idolatrous son Solomon. Do you know that Solomon is not listed in the book with the good kings? He was not considered one of the good kings. And that's incredible. And then after Solomon comes his son Rehoboam, and what's Rehoboam do? He splits the Israelites into 2 kingdoms. The north kingdom and the southern kingdom. The southern kingdom we call Judah. The northern kingdom was called Israel. And so they're split into 2. And there is no good king, according to Scripture, there is no good king found in the northern kingdom. And so what's God do? 722 BC, he hands them over to the Assyrians. They're wiped from the face of the earth. They're exiled into Assyria in 722 and never heard from again. Southern kingdom, though, Judah, they had 8 good kings. But after those 8 good kings, things went downhill. Right? And so God gave them over to the Babylonians, who carried them into exile. And they just left behind the poorest of the people of the land to work the vineyards and the fields. This is how it says it in 2 Kings chapter 25, verses 11 and 12. Nebuzaradan, the commander of the guard, carried into exile the people who remained in the city, along with the rest of the populace and those who had deserted to the king of Babylon. But the commander left behind the poorest people of the land to work vineyards and fields. But we've got to understand, even though they've just been exiled into Babylonia, there is hope. Because there's a prophet by the name of Jeremiah. And Jeremiah says in chapter 29 and verse 10, he says this, "This is what the Lord says. When 70 years are completed for Babylon, I will come to you and fulfill my gracious promise and bring you back to this place." They've got a promise that after 70 years, they're going home. The northern kingdom never had that promise. God never promised that he would restore them. And so out of the ashes of the exile and in the midst of the suffering appears Esther, Mordecai, and they call it a faithful remnant. And that faithful remnant included Daniel and three of his good buddies, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They were all there. And see, these people, these five in particular that we named, believed in God and trusted him no matter what objection came their way. The opposition would cry out against them, but it doesn't matter. Daniel, we know, went to the window and prayed when he was told not to. Shadrach and Meshach, Abednego, they did what they weren't supposed to do. They honored God. They prayed, and where'd they go? Fiery furnace, right? It was hotter in there than it is Florida in the summer. It was crazy, but that's what happened. But because they loved God, they obeyed God, they didn't care about the opposition. Here's what I want us to understand, and coming from Hugh's community meditation, sometimes you and I are just like those Israelites in Babylonia. Where's God? Where's God? You ever been a place in your life and that's the question, where's God? Well, we're going to give some answers to that today. The first answer I'm going to give is God is more informed than you think. God is more informed than you think. God is omniscient, and omniscient means all-knowing. God knows. He's more informed than we ever think he is. In Esther chapter 1 and verse 1, this is what happened during the time of Xerxes, the Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces, stretching from India to Cush. There's a lady, Florence Chadwick. She decided that she was going to become the first woman to ever swim the English Channel. And so for years, she trained, she disciplined herself. She trained her body to keep going even after her body said stop, right? And finally, in 1952, the big day came. She set out full of hope, surrounded by people, the well-wishers in the small boats that rowed along beside her. And of course, as in every event, there's those skeptics that hung around too. Those who doubted very much that she'd ever make it. Well, as she neared the coast of England, a very heavy fog settled in. Waters became increasingly cold. They became choppy. Her mother was encouraging her as she was on a boat right beside her. "Come on, Florence, you can make it. It's only a few more miles." Finally, exhausted, she asked to be pulled aboard the boat just a few hundred yards from her goal. She was defeated. She was heartbroken, especially when she discovered how close she had been to reaching her goal. And later she told the newspapers this, "I'm not offering excuses, but I think I could have made it if I'd been able to see my goal." Can I just say that is where we live? When we see God's hand working in our lives and we're on those mountaintops experiencing what God's doing for us, we can see him and we can reach those goals. But when we're in the pits, we're in the dark, we're walking through that dark valley, that shadow, where's God? Where's God? He's more informed than we think. You see, that's one of the most frequently asked questions when we are in a disaster, when we're in hurt, when we're looking for things to be right as we see them in our lives. The question is, where's God? What is God doing right now? It's all because we can't see him. More importantly, we can't see any evidence of him. And can I just be blatantly honest today? I think there are times in our lives when that stuff happens that we might even thinking God's dead. If we don't think it, there will be times that we do act it. That God is not there. See, in the book of Esther, there are a lot of names. In chapter 1, there are a lot of names. There's the king and the queen and 7 eunuchs or officers and the 7 nobles of Persia and the Media and who had special access to the king and were the highest in the kingdom. And then beginning in the next chapters, you'll hear names like Esther and Uncle Mordecai and Mordecai's enemy Haman. The name Xerxes. The name Xerxes occurs 30 times in those 9 chapters. Mordecai occurs 60 times, Esther 55 times, Haman 54 times. But in the book of Esther, there is one name that is so obviously missing. God. God is not mentioned in the book of Esther. Lord is not mentioned in the book of Esther. You know, there's a very small book in the Old Testament called Obadiah. It's got 1 chapter. That's my kind of reading right there. I can get through that one. And Obadiah has 6 references to God just in that one very short chapter. But in Esther, 9 chapters, and God is not mentioned. So you're thinking, okay, so why are we studying that book? God's not mentioned. The word God, the word Lord, not mentioned. So why are we doing this? I'm going to tell you why very quickly. Number 1, when you look at Esther, the book of Esther, there's no other book that we have in our scriptures that teach us more about God's prominence, about God's power, and about God's passion than you find in this book. It's amazing. And it's inescapable when you open that book up and you begin to read it with eyes piercing your faith. You see, God's penning right now the longest running play in world history. He assembles the biggest cast to perform their parts. God's the director. He's a screenwriter. He's the narrator. He's everything there is behind the scenes. The world's his opera house. It's his playhouse. He shapes the affairs of humanity. He schedules the actors for their roles and their stages and the scenes. You know, some of you may have seen a plaque. You may have this plaque in your own home that says, Christ is the head of this house, the unseen guest at every meal, and the silent listener to every conversation. Folks, in a very real sense, we are all cast into this big human drama, into this historical epic. We all have our bit parts. We have our sound bites. We have our supporting roles. We have our cameo appearances. We have our photo ops. We have our brightest moments, but listen, none of us are the consultants. None of us are the directors. None of us are doing the work behind the scenes. One person. God is doing that. So we do our routine. We read our lines. And then we exit the stage. God's more informed than you think. And there are things happening in your life that you may think Satan is trying to destroy you. And those same things that you think Satan might be trying to destroy you with are the same things that God says, I'm going to build you with. And we got to be careful how we look at that. Because God gave the Israelites, the northern kingdom, over to Assyria. He gave the southern kingdom, Judah, over to the Babylonians because of their sin in their life. to condemn them, to punish them. No, to bring them around and to redeem them. And that's what he does with us. I won't ever say that God causes something like that to happen to you, but there are times that those things happen and you're just wondering why. God, why would you let this happen? Because God's more informed than we are. God can see the picture bigger than we can. I use an illustration often of took my son Ryan to a baseball game when he's 5 years old. And he rolled up the program and we were sitting there and he just kind of went through this, and looking through the program. And he says, "Hey, Dad, there's not a whole lot of people here." And then you drop the program. You see, so many times in our lives, we're looking through that program. And God's looking at the stadium. 75,000 people sitting there, but I can only see about 15 or 20 through that program. But God knows before you do what's going to happen for you. So God's more informed than you think. The second thing I want us to understand is that God is more invested than we think. He's more invested. Shortly after his 50th birthday, Albert Einstein gave a remarkable interview. It happened to be with a Nazi sympathizer named George Sylvester Viereck, who challenged, I love this, he challenged Einstein. He said, "Do you believe in God?" I love Einstein's reply. He says, "I'm not an atheist. I don't think I can call myself a pantheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. We are in a position of a little child entering a huge library filled with many books in many languages. The child knows someone must have written those books, doesn't know how, doesn't understand the language in which they're written. The child dimly suspects a mysterious order in the arrangement of the books, but doesn't know what it is. That, it seems to me, is the attitude even of the most intelligent human being toward God. We see the universe marvelously arranged around us and obeying certain laws. We can only dimly understand those laws." I love that response. God's too big to completely understand. And that's what he's saying. See, the pessimists and the existentialists, the atheists, the liberal, they all say there is no God and there is no rhyme or reason to what's going on in the world today. But as you sit here this morning, and as I stand right here, we believe that everything happens for a reason. Do we understand the reason? No. Will we ever understand the reason? I don't know. But there is a reason, because there is a God who is in charge. For the good, the bad, the important, the trivial, the planned, the spontaneous. God. There's a simple little sentence that says, God is sovereign. Do you know what that means? God can do anything he wants, whenever he wants, however he wants. And the biggest thing it means, I'm not God. God is sovereign, and if we truly believe that, then we understand that everything that's happening around us is in God's hand. There's a question that was asked on a website a couple years ago. It said, "Do you believe things happen for a reason?" 14,500 people responded. 3% said, "Things happen for no reason." 3%. I love that. 28% said, "Well, some things happen for a reason." And then 69% said yes, very loudly to the question, that there is a reason for what happens. Keep that in mind. There is a reason for what happens. So as we look back to Israel, the thing that happened to Israel is the worst thing that could ever happen to a country. More catastrophic than a devastating earthquake or an economic embargo. It was a genocidal exile. 2 Kings chapter 24, We're going to begin in verse 14. He carried all Jerusalem into exile, all the officers and the fighting men and all the skilled workers and artisans, a total of 10,000. Only the poorest of the land were left. Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim captive to Babylon. Jehoiakim was a king at that time. He took from Jerusalem to Babylon the king's mother, his wives, his officials, and the prominent people of the land. The king of Babylon also deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 skilled workers and artisans, that all Jerusalem were carried into exile. All the officers, all the fighting men, all the craftsmen, all the artisans, 10,000 of them carried into exile, but only the poorest were left. And they were left for the vineyards and the fields. You see, Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim captive to Babylon. He also exiled Babylon, the king's mother, his wives, the officials, and leading men of Israel. He deported to Babylon the entire force of 7,000 fighting men, strong and fit for war, and 1,000 men. Listen, he did everything he could to destroy Israel. That's what it amounted to. Exile all those people into Babylon, become his slaves, but he left the poorest of the land, hoping that they would fail and the country would implode upon itself. That's what he was doing. There's a correlating story in the second book of Chronicles. In chapter 36, it says it like this. Furthermore, all the leaders of the priests and the people became more and more unfaithful. Following all the detestable practices of the nations and defiling the temple of the Lord, which he had consecrated in Jerusalem. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them through his messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers and despised his words and scoffed at his prophets until the wrath of the Lord was so aroused against his people, and there was so much, and there was no remedy. He brought up against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young men with a sword in the sanctuary, and spared neither young man or young woman, old man or aged. He handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar. Doesn't sound like God, does it? You see, in today's times, we love to preach the God of love and the God of grace, but there's also a God of justice. 4 times in the Hebrew language, God says that he will hand them over to Nebuchadnezzar. He says he will hand them over to their enemies. He says that he made them an object of dread and honor, of scorn. You see the idea of hand them over or made them? That's the same words in the Hebrew. There's no difference. And there is no worse punishment than exile. Even worse than an ethnic cleansing. Worse than their slavery in Egypt. But yet it could have been even worse. It could have been, how could it be any worse? Well, the 10 tribes of the northern kingdom never returned from Assyria. But the southern tribes of Judah did return 70 years later under Zerubbabel, Ezra, and Nehemiah. And yet this is a group that rejected and crucified the Messiah and their Savior, but they never were that idolatrous group that the way their fathers were. Now, when they returned to their land, they overdid it, all right? They overdid it. They became very prideful. They became very legalistic. They became very hypocritical, full of legalism. You see, the irony is that the faithfulness of the remnant, they were faithful when Israel was doomed. God delivered the Israelites to the Babylonians, but he didn't destroy them. He didn't deny them. Isn't that absolutely amazing? As evil as they were, as idolatrous as they were, as much as God's wrath was poured out upon them, he did not destroy them. New Orleans, Louisiana. San Francisco, California. Think of any worse cities in the United States than those two? They're still here, aren't they? Because of God's grace, they are here. But we need to understand, because of God's grace, we are here as well. We need to understand God's grace. God's more informed than we think, and God is more invested than we think. And lastly, God's more influential than we think. He's more influential. I mentioned God is sovereign. That means he's everywhere all the time doing what he wants to do. Sovereignty. See, so to me, Esther's an interesting book. There are a lot of critics who deny that the historicity of the book of Esther, and yet they're so puzzled by the author's undeniable knowledge of the Persian life, of the Persian customs. And they also charge that Esther, Mordecai, and Vashti were merely fictional names that somebody made up, and that Xerxes had only one wife in history, only in marriage. And furthermore, he would absolutely never have married a Jew. Of course, we got to understand, those same critics also said that all is lost. God is dead. Life is meaningless. And yet the book of Esther, folks, as we get through it, you will see how it just begs to differ with all of those thoughts. Esther is stylishly written. Opening with a curious introduction. The opening statement is, this is what happened. Or in Hebrew it says, and now it came to pass. My favorite verse in the Bible right there. It came to pass. Nothing ever stays the same. It will change. It will come to pass. But this book is also characteristic and typical of the books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel, Nehemiah, Ezekiel. Think about it. Joshua, that book was a bridge and a continuation of the story of the Israelites' journey into Canaan. That is after the death of Moses. The book of Judges continued the story after the death of Joshua. Ruth with the story of the Judges, and 1 Samuel with where the Judges left off. You see, the introduction of Esther is also similar to those of Nehemiah and Ezekiel, except the name of the book's author or primary character in the book of Esther is never stated. Nehemiah, the cupbearer for the king. Prophet. Ezekiel, prophet. They declared their names and their roles. But unlike those books, this is what's so good. God is sovereign, right? So God can begin to write a new chapter. He can begin to write a new book any time in history that he chooses, in any place. Because God can intervene into history whenever he wants. You know how much history you and I see? If we're lucky. In my case, I'm hoping for 85 years. That'll be all the history I have. And I don't want to go any longer than that. Let me rephrase that. I'm not sure Joan wants me to go any longer than that. That'll give her 30 years without me, because I know she's going to live to be 105. That's all the history we see. God sees it all. He sees all that history, and he can intervene anytime he likes. You see, by an act of providence, the Israelites were deported by a Chaldean king, Nebuchadnezzar. Do you know, in our history, in church history or in biblical history, Christianity history, however you want to look at it, do you know that there's a very famous person that was a Chaldean that we honor? Know who it was? Abraham. Abraham was a Chaldean. He and his whole family. We find that in Genesis chapter 11. So essentially, the Israelites returned to their ancestral homeland under forced exile. So when he took them to Babylonia, Babylonia was actually where Abraham was from, the land of Chaldea. But it could have been worse. Because you see, the southern kingdom was not treated with the same contempt that northern tribe was under the Assyrians, and did not become a historical footnote never heard of again. But I will tell you that, we read about Xerxes and the king and all this stuff. He was really never the person in charge. According to history, the real king, Xerxes, he wasn't a good king at all. His honor that's mentioned in verse 4, by the way, that's a word that's making its scriptural debut. It wasn't that glorious. His citadel in Susa, making its first occurrence in the Bible too, was not that secure. His life was not real colorful, even though we find the words white, green, red, and black all recorded for the first time in the Bible. And the bed of gold that he prided himself in having. Who wants to sleep on a bed of gold? I'd be sleeping on a bunch of rocks, wouldn't it? But that's what he did. That's who he was. Historians tell us that he suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of the Greeks before he returned to select Esther as his queen. Listen, this man had a lot more to worry about than women's respect or disrespect to their husbands. All the discord in his family. And both those words occurred only once in the Bible, as well as his drunkenness. It's the first time that appeared too. The king's fury, though, that we find in verse 12 of chapter 1, served God's purpose. In a sense, it was a deja vu all over again. Right? This was the same Hebrew word for Pharaoh's fury that sent the baker and the butler into the same cell with an immigrant named Joseph. An encounter that would propel Joseph to the second in power only to Pharaoh. This time, the king's fury was the occasion of a new generation of Josephs and heroes in much, much farther land. You see, all I want to do this morning as we introduce this book of Esther is for me and you to understand. God's name's not here. The Lord's name's not here. But when we start to look through this book, his prominence, his passion are all over it. So God is more active in our lives than we may think. He's more aware of our suffering than we ever want to give him credit for. And he's a whole lot more attentive to our needs than we think he is. You see, God's often uninvited. He's unexpected. And yet his peace and his presence always linger if we are willing to see them. Distance, danger, and at times even disobedience will do very little to drive him away. He will stay. So today, if you're sitting in one of those times where it's not a good time in your life, maybe you'd even consider it a pretty bad time. Where's your faith when the chips are down? Where is your faith when the odds are stacked against you? There's a very simple phrase that Joan and I have used for several years is that, are you a victim or are you a victor? My prayer this morning is that all of us will understand that as God is so close, he's so active, he's so informed, that our faith will grow in such a way that we will understand that we are victors.